Hello and welcome back to the Comic Literate Podcast, the podcast that does deep dives into the best of comic books, graphic novels, mangas, and penny dreadfuls. I'm your host, the soon-to-be known as Comic Stan, and with me, as always, is my neighbourly co-host, it's Jamie.
Neighbourly?
It's a theme going for this month. But before we get to that...
You know what? Just before you go anywhere else...
Before we get to...
you called me neighbourly. It's really ironic, because I have new neighbours upstairs.
And they would disagree?
Well... I was walking towards the flat earlier and their dog was barking. I went, for fuck's sake, dog, shut up. And then
Dogs can sense evil.
And then I noticed their window was open. And so their the first time they've ever heard me is either me playing really loud metal music at like 10 o'clock at night because I was trying to write a song, or me swearing at their dog through the window.
And both are bad.
Neither are good.
This is why people tend to recommend the 2-year fixed mortgages when they first move into a place, because the extreme advice always is, you don't know if your neighbour's going to play drums at 3 in the morning.
So anyway, back to the before that came before the before.
So the first before we got to your before.
Penny dreadfuls.
So it being the spooky season and all that.
That was really good. Can you do that again?
The spooky season. It's close enough. Or my other names for it. Scary season. Scary Spooktober. Spocktober. No, that's a different thing.
Spocktober. I want to do Spocktober.
Next year, maybe.
Oh.
We'll see if he remembers, but don't no one remind him just in case.
You know I have a freakish memory.
On some things, and not so much on others.
Do you remember in September 2023 when you said we could do Spocktober?
But you also have
You
also have a memory of did we say 8 o'clock?
When I rock up at 9 looking a bit dishevelled.
It varies wildly, is all I'm saying. So what I was going to get into was, because it's the spooky season and all that, I had an idea, and I thought, let's...
For the listener, we've talked about this off air, and I find this completely hilarious.
I mean, I think this is now a staple of the podcast lore now, going forward. So... I thought, it'd be cool. Let's do a scary Penny Dreadful, because I thought they were very small Victorian era comics, like one of the earliest comics, and turns out that was a misconception on my part entirely.
What are Penny Dreadfuls, Ryan?
So Penny Dreadfuls are very short pieces of a short story. A written short story.
Yeah.
They would have an illustration on the front, which is, I think, where I got confused, because I saw these illustrations. I thought, this is like early comics. Turns out it's just the cover. It's like the cover. But it was short stories that were then divided even further into like individual pages.
Yeah.
And those pages were bought for like, I don't know, whatever tuppence was, or a shilling or whatever back in the day. And the reason they were popular at the time is because they were written quite simply, and it was at the point where the general population had just kind of learned collectively how to read. Yeah. But my mistake, I think, was I thought they were illustrations that were popular because it was just before people could commonly read. So I thought they were popular because they were just short, like speech bubbles, as opposed to written text.
It seems like that is the kind of thing that I would have known about. Like, it seems like that's the kind of thing that would have been within my remit to just know about.
Well, I think I said it and you just believed me.
Well, this is the thing. Like, I just to see when you put it in the intro and started talking about Penny Dreadfuls, I was like, cool, Penny Dreadfuls. I assumed they were like inky, pulpy comics from like the mid 20th century.
Yeah, exactly the same. Yeah, and I think I got it first from, I think, like a lot of people, the TV show Penny Dreadfuls. And that TV show was basically about it was kind of a League of Extraordinary Gentlemen kind of thing. It was melding all the werewolf and Dracula and Frankenstein and I mean, it was the Victorian era, so obviously. I mean, as Alan Moore will tell you, if you're going to write the Victorian era,
you've got to make it real
misogyny in there. But and because it was based on those things, I thought, I don't know where I got the comics bit from. We're gonna have to change the intro. That might have been the last time Penny Dreadfuls was in the intro. So maybe it's just a list of 3 now, which is more stereotypical, or maybe I'll replace it with something else.
I mean, a list of 3 punches harder.
It does. But it's gonna be there's gonna be several episodes where I go graphic novels, mangas. And that's it. It's going to be, like when the year changes, if you write the date
absolutely.
And you write like 2002, turn that 2 into a 3. Jesus Christ.
I love that 2002 is the year that you went to.
Well, it's the last one that happened.
2002?
Yeah. The change from 2 to 3. That was the last one. Because the next one's 3 to 4, isn't it?
Yeah, but the last time we changed from 2 to 3 was this year.
Well, yeah, this
new
year.
20 years ago.
No, I'm talking about this. I'm talking about the last one. The 22 to 23.
Oh, I thought you said 2002 and 2003.
I might have said that mistakenly. You know me.
In our head, it's still the early noughties.
I'm a stream of... I mean, in my heart, it's always the early noise. I refuse to grow up. And speaking of the noughties, there were neighbours in the noughties. And speaking of neighbours... We are doing a new title this week, in theme with Spooky Season. This is a horror-themed-esque kind of story that's releasing this year. Little clue as to what we thought of it. But it's called The Neighbours, and it's a 5-issue run from this year.
This is an instance where good neighbours do not make good friends.
That is clever. I had something kind of up my sleeve on that, but I think you've nailed it already.
Thank you.
And just to get out the way at the top, because I think we're going to have a little bit of a back and forth, maybe.
Are we about to fall out?
Well, I think we're going to have to mention. I don't think
you fucked up the Penny Dreadfuls
I'm
thing.
not taking a hard stance, put it that way.
I mean, it would be a challenge.
But so from Boom Studios, The Neighbours, brand new 5-issue limited series from highly acclaimed writer, apparently, Jude Ellison S. Doyle, with artist Letizia Cadonici. I'm not sure how the correct pronunciation there, but I'm going with one of those.
Yeah.
But interestingly, Letizia was we're on first name basis now.
Of course.
Was the artist from the Something's Killing the Children.
Right,
House of Slaughter.
okay.
And right off the bat, I will say probably my favorite thing about this was the art.
Yeah, the art was serviceable.
We do tend to start on the art, and I think it's because it's the safest non-spoiler subject to get into first.
So I'm going to be honest with you here.
Yep.
I didn't notice the art, which tells me it was serviceable, but it also means it wasn't wildly good.
To me, I really enjoyed the art, and I think that I noticed the art more because there was more panels that were no dialogue. So in those, you have to look at it. I appreciated the facial features and expressions of the characters. I thought they were pretty nailed on.
I mean, I think Casey, the daughter stroke stepdaughter character who gets turned or replaced or whatever. It's
a changeling of the genre, the subgenre of horror. It's a changeling kind of situation.
I feel that her facial expressions were probably the most interesting bit of character that was happening. I
did appreciate the expressions of fear on the other characters, like the two main characters. See, I think because I suspect we both found the dialogue and story a bit lacking.
A bit.
And in that regard, for me, I was like, well, let's have a look. Let's focus more on the art then. And then I was appreciating the art more.
It was credit where credit's due. The art was fine. It was pulling its weight. The whole comic was laid out really well. There was never that moment where I had to zoom right into a panel to look at it. I never found myself struggling to follow it. Just wasn't saying much. You know, it was just the whole thing left me feeling really flat.
That's fair. In that regard, in that spirit, do you want to give us a brief synopsis of what the story was on it?
Yeah, trans person has anxiety, moves to the countryside, their stepdaughter gets taken underground and replaced with a changeling, and shit goes south.
I mean, yeah, that's probably your most succinct, accurate recollection of the story ever, to be fair. Because normally you go into the big meanings and stuff, and I guess that in itself is maybe a bit of a clue.
There's not any big meanings here, is there?
Well, so one thing, I mean, basically you summed up the story. I think the only added wrinkle is also the other character of the couple, whose name I forget, but I will bring it up right now. But she...
The redhead.
Yes. Janet. She also has a bit of a taking on the responsibility of trying to keep the family happy and together kind of thing, and I think that stress kind of weighs on her character a bit.
Yeah.
But essentially, as you say, they move out to the country, and it's a more rural America, and it's basically heavily implied, or downright openly, explicitly stated later in the comic.
Yeah.
But it's basically because the character Oliver is a trans man and has just recently transitioned and was not happy in the I think it's New York, was it? I think it was like
it's
urban New York.
Never stated, but it's implied.
A New York style, a big city, a metropolitan.
Yeah.
Didn't like it there, so moved out here, moved into the rural area to get away from everything. But then it turns into that kind of rural Wicker Man-esque type, like there's something.
We meet the witch.
Yeah, there's
the
weird
local
people
Wiccan.
around. I mean, yeah, exactly. So, yeah, that's basically the story. And then one of the characters, the daughter of Janet, stepdaughter of Oliver, Casey basically goes missing, but then is not missing, and it's probably something else that's taken her place.
And do you know what? They did try to do a little bit of show, not tell storytelling. And I'll credit where credit's due. The first time we meet Casey, she walks through to Oliver and says, "I'm not going to be calling you Dad." And then the moment she gets replaced with the changeling, she has a pig grin on her face and she says, "Hi, Dad." And it becomes very apparent that she has been replaced. And I'm like, okay, they tried. They tried to do show, not tell, but it was so fucking on the nose because that "I'm not going to call you Dad" was her first piece of dialogue. And then she disappeared and the first thing she said afterwards was, "Hi, Dad."
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't her first bit of dialogue. So her first bit of dialogue was a very explicit reference to climate change.
Yeah, fuck, because she's vegan.
Yeah. And that is one thing I kind of found with that first issue was there's a lot of natural, like, in that kind of story that you're showing what the characters are like through dialogue and trying not to make it. The dialogue didn't sound overly expositional as other titles we've done, but I did very much get a strong sense of what the writer was trying to put in about the characters. Like, they are very socially conscious, they're very liberal, like, they talk shit about Fox News, like, very early on. And rightfully so. Like, it's not like nothing they've said is incorrect or I disagree with. But you know when someone, like, when you meet a person in real life and they're very overtly stating what their beliefs are very quickly after meeting them.
Yeah.
Like, and you kind of feel like, you don't feel like a real person. Like, it doesn't feel like real dialogue. But I believe these type of people exist. So I'm kind of half and half. I'm like, whether I like it or not.
They're like, it's a real trope of modernity, isn't it? They're like believable people because that is the way that people will introduce themselves.
Yeah.
Oh, hi, I'm a vegan.
Yeah.
I was vegetarian for a long time, like 6 or 7 years, but there's that old joke about vegans, isn't it? How do you know somebody's a vegan?
Don't worry, they'll tell you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, no, I get it. I totally get it. The characters were believable. They're just believably annoying.
Yeah, and that's coming from people who are very much on the left, very liberal.
Yeah, like, I am a little snowflake. Little Snowflake would be my hip hop name.
I'm all for bringing back the guillotine to kill the rich. Like, that's the level I'm at. So
yeah, eat the rich.
Yeah,
eat the rich.
But yeah, I'm on the fence because on the one hand, it kind of took me out of it a little bit, but on the other, I still feel like it's written like real people. So it's kind of hard to then criticize on that regard. Like, it's believable writing, but yeah, it didn't make me as warm to the characters as I might have been.
And the whole premise of the story requires us to care about these characters.
Yep.
And I was just going through it like, I don't give a fuck. Okay, Janet started smoking. I don't care. Oliver's testosterone gets smashed and he needs to go to the pharmacy that he doesn't want to do because he wanted 6 months of like quietly existing. I don't care. Just there's something about the way these characters were written that made me not care about them.
Yeah, I think I'm in the same boat of you. Wasn't as emotionally attached to the story.
Yeah,
but because of that, because I kind of took a bit of a step back, I appreciated some of the techniques that I saw. But it was very much in like a analytical way, not in a I'm gripped by the story and I need to know what happens next kind of way.
I mean, I suppose this is the thing. There is noticing that these techniques, these authorial techniques, are present. But if it's not an effective piece of literature, then it's all wasted anyway. So yeah, there was techniques being used, but I don't think any of it was effective because ultimately, I'm in a horror and I don't care about any of the characters.
Yeah,
and that's one of the things that horrors. It's one of the things that Maniac of New York quite successfully did. Is actually it painted characters that we could kind of get behind a little bit. And I wasn't the biggest fan of that, was I? But at least there we had these characters that kind of you could get behind a little bit and you could understand them and they had depth and layers and stuff. And they did all of the things that would add depth to these characters without actually making me care about them at all.
Yeah, I think there is a trope in a lot of horrors of like family moves to a new house or area.
Yeah.
And I think the problem with this is it didn't give itself enough time or it didn't have enough time to really build that beforehand. Like to obviously make you emotionally attached to the characters, but also just to understand the situation on an emotional level. This was very much here's what the characters are in. Like, this is the situation they're in right now.
Yeah, and this is exactly like the kind of family dynamic that I'm interested in seeing presented in fiction right now.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Like the idea of seeing a trans man navigate becoming a stepdad. That's objectively quite interesting, and that's, you know, it's a trope in fiction that we wouldn't have even thought to see 20 years ago, and now it's a thing that could happen, and it's something that's, you know, it's interesting because there's a lot of layers there. And so don't get me wrong, like I really wanted to like this because I really wanted to like what it stood for. I really liked the idea that we had a trans character presented, and a trans character presented really naturalistically. But I just didn't care about any of them.
Yeah, and I think a prime example, I think, of what you said is, for me, there was a bit of I said earlier it wasn't as over-expositional, but in some parts it was now that I think about it. One of the examples I just thought of was, there's a part where, I mean, you can tell, obviously, through... It's inferred the situation where Oliver has then recently transitioned and they've moved away, and especially
it's not inferred, it's straight up stated in the first couple of panels. Yeah. He says, I think she clocked me. And his wife turns around and says, she's old, she's never heard of a trans person.
Yeah, but at least...
It's there in panel 2, man.
But at least that's more like inferring from exchanged dialogue rather than being told straight up.
I don't know, it still smacks of, hello, Yorick, my father.
Yeah. Well, the bit I was going to mention, which I kind of supports what he's saying, is there's a part where Casey says, oh, yeah, so there's somewhere like how things are changing. And she goes, oh, yeah, my mum left my mum and married a woman who's now a man. Oh, God, with a woman who's now a man.
No, like, that's the interesting thing. She says, you left mum for a much younger woman.
That's it, yes.
And like, did you notice that Casey misgenders Oliver at the start?
But yes, and then says, who's now a man.
Yeah.
And so for me, that was very over-expositional because you could tell what the situation was. And I feel like you could have done a less expositional way of getting across Casey's not happy with it without her just blatantly saying, this is what I'm unhappy with. And
she just needs to walk past them. There just needs to be a panel of her barging past him in the corridor.
And if they hadn't done that, but they had done the I'm not calling you dad more in isolation, I think that would have played a lot better.
It would have landed a bit better.
Yeah, because that would have come out of nowhere and told you a lot immediately.
Yeah.
Whereas by that point, that line, I'm not going to call you dad, we'd already know.
They're labouring a point. It's a redundancy, isn't
exactly. So I think you could cut away a lot of the over-expositional dialogue and just let the reader... This kind of seems to me a bit of like the writer being worried that the audience wasn't going to get everything. Or wasn't going to like catch on to everything, so kind of fear of like, I need to make it clear just in case, you know. That
they were worried that their really deep, rich story was going to go over people's heads, right?
More like that they were going to miss the details, the backstory details.
Fucking hell! It just, I hate to say it, it just wasn't a very well told story.
That's fair. I mean, right now we're just talking about the characters and the state they're in.
Yeah.
What did you think of like the building tension of the horror? And I use that as just like a plainly like. Well, I'm not saying it was scary, but like, what do you think of that attempt?
It didn't fly, like it didn't land. So, I mean, I suppose a big element of this is that they only had 5 very short issues to work with. I smashed through this in half an hour. So I've only actually spent half an hour with the text.
I actually read it and then reread it.
Well, because it's so short.
Yeah, mainly reason I reread it is because I was trying to nail on like the lore of the horror and everything, but we'll get to that later.
So I didn't give a shit. Yeah. But so Casey gets changelinged.
But like that scene where the guy turns up in the middle of the night and it's just like, I'm here to fix the house, and she's like, no, you're not. I felt like that was at least a good paced ramping up of something wrong happening. Like I feel like they took the necessary time to be like, here's a guy. She closes the door on him. Then he says, hey, he knocks again and she's panicking and he's like, no, your phone's out here. And then to get and you think that I did appreciate that kind of almost like red herring of like, oh no, it's still happening. Oh, she left her phone out there. And then again, it then goes into her getting the phone and he's still out there and then pushes in. So I think like
Yeah.
I appreciate that kind of sense of the pacing of the ramping tension was it did the job for me, at least.
Yeah, I suppose. And I suppose that moment where Oliver kind of amps himself up to go outside because he's agoraphobic, clearly.
Yeah.
And then he goes out there and sees her be taken, and then he comes through and she's just sat in the house and she says, "Hi, Dad." That was probably the most effective part of the whole thing for me.
Yeah.
Is that sense of, oh God, they're in the house.
That moment did at least make me go, ooh, what's going to happen next? Like,
Yeah.
that was, for me, a big part.
But then the rest of it was just kind of this meandering, like, story. Like, it just didn't go anywhere for me.
I think at that point, it was trying to, again, ramp up this, like, there's something evil happening here, but it just didn't come off as... There was not enough explicit stuff to be worried about, or it was showing too much to be as scared of it. The fact that they show they have a old woman who lives essentially next door to them,
creepy old Wiccan,
who is a witch essentially, and I don't know. I know like later on with the plot point that she is, but I don't know if at the start was she meant to be scary or was that meant to create tension? Because immediately, like seeing her, the child interacting with her, I immediately gone, oh, she's fine. Because
I instantly knew that she was a red herring. I instantly knew that she was a character that I was supposed to find creepy.
Yeah.
But that ultimately she was going to be not the villain of the piece. But that's just because of the million times that I've seen a crone in fiction. You know, the idea of the crone is always really well worn, and the idea of the Wiccan or the witch in fiction. And they're often there to kind of make you think of, you know, bad things are going to happen, but actually, ultimately, they are not the villain of the piece.
I think the thing that did it for me was seeing that the child, so they've got 2-year-old Isabel, the fact that she was just like happy to go see the witch and to be around her. The trope of horrors normally is that like children and animals can normally sense what's evil. And it's only when things get really insidious and really kind of meta or genre breaking do they kind of challenge that. But as a general trope, if a child likes a character, they're probably going to be all right in the end.
Probably all right, yeah.
Exactly. Whereas then the child, if they're scared of a character, and then you're like, oh, that's the bad one, really.
Yeah.
But yeah, I so immediately I was kind of like, well, she's a plot point, but she's like you exactly. Like she's probably not the bad person, or she's not like the evil in it. And then the guy turns up, and it's like, okay, he's obviously evil. Coming back to the art, I love the use of the complete blackness for him against the black of night.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah.
So again, this was the time I was like taking the time to just be like...
really look at it.
Yeah, I was like, hey, what's going on with the panel? And I did like, they used pitch black for the darkness behind him and for the character. And they still managed to distinguish him from the background. So it wasn't just like eyes in darkness kind of thing. So again, like that's the point where I was like, the art's really doing the heavy lifting for me to enjoy it. I think that, and again, that's what I mean. That was most of my enjoyment was from the art.
By heavy lifting, though, we mean like a 20-kilo deadlift.
I mean, whatever listeners' version of heavy. Like we might have some absolute juice heads who are just like cranking out 60, 70 kilos. So.
Can you comiclitter@gmail.com.
Tell us your PBs.
Yeah. I just want you guys to email us with your deadlift, bench press, and squat PBs.
Because it's a new day. You can be a comic book fan and a gym goer these days.
Not
that we're going to start, but, you know, you can be.
I think we should have a comic literate PB competition where we compete to see who can have, like, the highest deadlift PB.
I think we'll do that, like, once we get to a point, because I'd love to do some, like, charity things, like raising money for charity kind of stuff.
Lift things.
Exactly. So, like, we're comic book guys, and we're going to try and lift this heavy weight. Ooh, my bloody back!
my delicate fingers that are used to turning soft pages.
My comic book turning hand. Oh no. Yeah, so we'll save that for that stuff. Once we've got a bit more of an audience, we'll raise money for things like that.
But if, humble listener, you do happen to lift, as I say, let us know your PBs. We want to see how strong you are.
And back to the comic again. Or for the first time, this one. But back to the art game as well. I really like the cover art of each issue. I felt like they're always a bit different from the normal art. And I think those were like sufficiently creepy that I would, if I saw this in a comic book shop, I'd be like, oh, what's going on in there kind of thing.
Did you like it then?
I think I liked elements of it, except for the ones that I think I was supposed to care the most about. Do you know what I mean? Like,
so you liked it despite the fact you didn't really like it?
It's really hard to describe because what I mean by that is obviously it's meant to make you worried for the safety of the characters, and that just didn't really hit for me in this.
Me neither.
But because I'm a horror fan, I'm like, what's the horror here? Like, what's the thing? Like, what's the reveals going to be and that kind of stuff. But yeah, I in terms of its main goal, that obviously didn't work for me as well, which I think is a bit of an indictment.
I also think the ending was flaccid.
Yeah, I think so.
Do you know what they did, though? They did a Lost.
Well, hey, that could mean a lot of things. So we'll get into that. The
very ending, they did a Lost, didn't they?
I would say before we get into that, I mean, generally, like I would say you do not recommend this at all, right?
No.
That's fair. I would say, I don't recommend this, and it's rare that I give that for this kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think one important distinction that I'm noticing is when a superhero comic is bad, I'm a lot quicker to shit on it. Yeah. But that's because I feel a lot more confident in my saying, like, this is objectively bad, because I feel like I've got the experience for it. These kind of comics I don't read as much, and I hope to, especially in doing this. But this one especially just
fell super flat, didn't it?
I think if you enjoyed Something's Killing the Children or House of Slaughter, which is the spin-off series, which is really good.
Yeah.
If you enjoyed that, you'll get something from the art. Like, if you really enjoyed those titles and the art and that, it's worth reading this. That's the one specific recommendation I'll make is for the art.
Yeah, and again, like, I remember really enjoying the art in Something's Killing the Children. I remember it being really good. And I don't think the art in this was as interesting.
I think
or
the art,
exciting.
I think in Something's Killing Children, the art was a bit more disciplined.
Yeah,
it had to do normal stuff more of the time, and then when it got weird, that made it stand out more. Whereas this always tries to carry an eerie feeling by being not quite right or something's off.
Something I will say is that the artist did a really good job of capturing Oliver in all of the different phases of his transition.
Yeah, great physical proportions and details of the person.
Yeah, like because we saw a bit of him when he first met Janet, and we saw him as a little boy.
A boy in a girl's body, is that
he is
correct?
And was a boy?
Yes.
He was a little boy, but he was a femme presenting boy.
Yes.
So we saw him when he was really femme presenting as a child. And then we saw him kind of just pre-transition and then obviously quite far into his transition. And I think the artist really nailed that. Like he was a believable person in all of those stages. And again, I think Casey was really well drawn throughout. Like Casey was always interesting to look at.
Very distinctive pre and post changeling.
Yeah.
Like you can tell just looking at it, it's like, oh, she's possessed or whatever it is. Like it's very quick. You can very obviously see that difference between the characters.
Yeah. Do you think there's some trans allegory in there?
This was going to be my next point, actually.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed, and I think they did a good job of showing Oliver's experiences being a trans person and literally their experience transitioning. And for someone who, is extremely cis to a fault, I appreciated seeing this other side. Like,
to a fault.
Yeah.
I'm so comfortable in my gender, it's a bad thing.
But it did make me appreciate, like, I never had to go through any of this stuff.
Yeah,
and I think, like, us being, trying to be aware of these kind of things, it's really helpful when, like, you consciously know that trans people have these kind of experiences and these trials and tribulations. But this did a good job for me of showing it in a more empathetic, emotional way.
Yeah.
The problem is that it wasn't barely related to the horror.
Yeah,
and to the main story.
It's like he was almost shoehorned in, wasn't it?
Yeah, I feel like you could literally cut out all the bits with Oliver and his past and the bit of the emotional, like, hallucinogenic things that happened towards the end. If you took all those parts out, you could just make like a one issue, like, here's a story of a person transitioning and getting to grips with it, and that would be really good in itself.
And I think there's a bunch of comics about that I've seen floating around. Like, there's a bunch of comics that do quite succinctly deal with the trans experience, and we've not really read any yet. I think possibly because they don't necessarily fall within the remit, and we step outside the remit sometimes and do other stuff, but this is very much like a comic book podcast for comic book nerds, right? But no, and I completely agree with you. I think that's actually dealt with quite sensitively.
And I did appreciate, so something that there's a term now called like elevated horror, and there might be different terms other people. Though elevated horror is horror in more recent years, has tried to take modern social issues, but also just issues that are more modern. Trying to explain it using the same words over and over again, but it's basically like modern issues and social issues that are then use a horror trope as a vehicle for it. So like prime example and the best ones is Get Out by Jordan Peele. So he took that.
Oh yeah, fucking hell, that's terrifying, isn't it?
Taking that white people's borderline fetishization of black people and turning that into a horror with this specific horror aspect. And that worked really well because the social issue and the horror went hand in hand perfectly. Like they worked off each other seamlessly. And that's why that, in my opinion, that's why that movie was so revered. And then to compare this, I think, actually comes... well, interestingly, actually, I compare this a bit more to Jordan Peele's second film, Us, because that attempted the same thing and the execution just wasn't as good.
Yeah.
And it felt the issues and the horror felt a bit more separate from each other. Still, Jordan Peele did a really good job with Us, but when you obviously, any kind of artist, their first thing is great, their second thing is going to be held to that standard, and then if it's anywhere short, it's like, well, that wasn't as good.
Yeah.
So it'd be good on its own, but yeah. So, and this is what I get from this, is that they tried to match the alienation or the alienation of this family and specifically this trans character and their fear of prejudice, and then they tried to transpose that with like I said before, the Wicker Man kind of moving into rural area and everyone seemingly off and there's something dark going on in the background.
There is a stunning irony to somebody who is trans being fearful of people looking at them and perceiving them as different, moving out of a city that is implied to be New York into a rural area. Because you would think that if you were somebody who was scared of being made the other and was scared of, homophobic or transphobic retribution, the place that you would find solace in is the city where nobody notices you and where you are just a face.
And specifically, if it's a liberal city, like in these days, that is normally a more of a considered like safer hub for people. Like that, people are drawn to those communities because they're the strongest in those metropolitan cities. Yeah,
absolutely. And then you go to
bumfuck nowhere.
Yeah, go to bumfuck nowhere, and we don't like your kind round here, and we man.
And just to be clear, we are recording this from bumfuck nowhere, so we are allowed to say that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm quite proudly from bumfuck nowhere.
We are bumfuck nowhere. Ians.
Bumfuck nowhere Uckians.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So, yeah. And I think one thing I did really enjoy as well, coming back to all this, is I really enjoyed Oliver's the use of him developing agoraphobia in response to his paranoia from transitioning.
Yes.
And I think they do very explicitly try and show his fear of a transphobic society. And I think the dialogue, it just kind of put it out there too plainly.
Yeah.
And the only time I really felt it was in the flashback when he just transitioned and it was his like first time out post-transition with Isabel, and him walking into the subway and spilling a bottle of like Coke or something. And just that little benign thing did like making a feeling of unease.
Yeah.
Of like, you've just done something and now everyone's looking at you and that's the fear and that causing the agoraphobia. I really like that aspect.
Yeah. And I feel like I've had that experience where I felt really uncomfortable or out of place, like on a New York City subway train or in the tube in London. And you're like, fuck, I just, I don't fit in here. I feel weird. Do you know what I mean? And so I'm with you there. And again, I mean, I didn't like Oliver as a character. I thought he was kind of a bellend, and I think he's meant to be likable. I think this is like, again, I don't judge fiction by how much or how little I like the characters, because there's a real charm to a deeply unlikable character. But I feel like Oliver was set up as a character that we were supposed to like, and I just didn't find myself really.
I think that it relied too much on just empathy for his situation rather than actually giving him qualities to be likable.
Yeah.
Because I think if you go back and read this, you can't pinpoint anything because normally in horror, like when the character's meant to be like a main character's meant to be empathetic, they're very much given like they're a good friend and they're a good person, and they're just having a laugh. They're innocent, and we can empathize that way. Yeah, and I think here Oliver he's got a bit of a shell put up, a bit of a hard exterior that's affecting his relationship. So it's empathetic in that way, but it's empathetic in the way of like couples have problems, and not like, oh, it's a shame that this couple is having problems because we like these people and we want them to work out. It doesn't really get that across, I don't think.
I suppose there's one thing that now that I'm really thinking about it, there's one thing it does do quite a good job of, and it's that sense of alienation that one person experiences when they're in an existential horror and they have seen the thing and the rest of the characters don't believe them. So the Twilight Zone episode where that monster thing is taking bits off the plane and one person sees it. The Simpsons parodied it really well.
Yeah.
And I actually think the Simpsons parody is better. So that's the one I'm going to talk about, where Bart, that goblin thing, is taking bits of the bus off.
A gremlin? Is it a gremlin on the side of a plane?
Yeah. And so, Bart sees it and nobody else believes him and he starts to look a bit mad. There's a little bit of that happening where he says, oh, Casey's different. She ate raw meat today. And the mum goes, well, she's anemic. She used to do that all the time before she was vegetarian.
I think I made this exact same note.
Yeah.
Because I read that and I went, that's not a good explanation.
No.
Like, she ate raw meat. Like, oh, she used to do that all the time. That's worse.
Yeah.
Like, what the fuck was she before she changed? Like, that's...
But, and the worst bit is she used to eat raw hamburger out of the fridge.
Exactly,
I'm like, the worst kind of... If it's a steak, I can get behind it, but a hamburger's been ground up and that's where all the bacteria come from. It's really unsafe.
Speaking as a
son of a butcher.
Yeah.
But I like, that was the one element of the kind of horror that I liked, is the alienation that Oliver felt.
Yeah, Oliver trying to be like, all this weird stuff is happening, and his most trusted person is like, no, you are imagining it. It's not real.
Yeah.
And I think this is what I was saying before. Like, there are elements of the horror element that I'm like, I like this execution in isolation. I feel like the bit with Oliver in the train station in the city just post transition. I think if you'd put that near the start, I think I would have started off empathizing with him immediately, and then seeing him being a bit difficult in the house. Then I would have been like, well, of course he's being difficult because he's just been through this.
Yeah.
Whereas when you see him off the bat, just like, I can't go outside and I need you to do it. I mean, he's not like that.
You're paraphrasing.
Yeah. But when seeing him like that initially, you just kind of go like, "Ooh, that seems a bit difficult for Janet." And then,
or Janet.
But then Casey is like, "Hey, you made me move out of here to like leave my home and come to this place." And then you're like, "Oh, Janet, like bloody hell, like what are you doing to Casey?" And then Casey's a bitch to Oliver, and you're like, "Oh, Casey, come on!" Like, there's a vicious circle of like them taking out their frustrations on the situation. Yeah, they're taking out on each other, and then you end up just not really liking any of them. I think that's the problem. Yeah, but then if we'd started with Oliver showing his fear in the city, it very quickly tells you why they're out in the rural area, but also why it's not just peachy keen, like everything's fixed now. Like that, it would get across the weight of why they needed to put themselves in now this difficult situation they're in.
Yeah, and I think there's a certain element of when we see this trope in horror, whereby people are like, "I'm going to move because it's going to fix a problem that I have." As an adult, I think we all kind of know that you can't run away from yourself. And if something is a problem in one place, moving isn't going to address that problem, right? And so actually, they're kind of idiots because they're grown adults who think that uprooting their family is actually going to fix one of their mental health problems.
But then
that doesn't work.
But then that is a relatable thing in the real world, isn't it? Like a lot of people do that kind of thing. Like,
I suppose a change is as good as the rest.
I think what would have helped. So from this point, I think we do need to get into the ending to examine that.
Yes, the lost that they did.
Yes. And so again, if you got to this point, like I think we've given you enough. You either read it for yourself or you just listen to the ending without reading it. But normally with this kind of horror, and again the elevated horror, when it takes like a personal issue of the character and then uses a horror trope to explore it, you normally have some kind of resolution that makes the character better off. So with horror, typically it's either they survive and are better for it, like what didn't kill them has made them stronger, or they die. And it's
problem's over.
It's normally one of those for either the horror has won and that's the scary thing, or you've been on the journey with the character and now they're better off for it.
Yeah.
And in this, the ending didn't really do anything for the characters, but it also didn't. They didn't die.
Well, you could argue it did a lot for Janet.
Yes, but again, we don't know the weight of that. So this is why I read it twice. So I got to the end and I was trying to figure out what happened here. Like what is the situation? So I think one of my criticisms here is it either showed too much or not enough.
Yes.
And that sounds like I'm just being picky and saying both options.
No, I agree with you.
But what I mean is, by showing a bit too much, it made me as a horror fan go, okay, so what are we dealing with? Is it a mass possession? Is the city, is the town evil?
Just enough that I have a bunch of like unanswered questions.
Exactly.
So they either could have really fleshed the world out and shown me a lot more and really given me a sense of what Janet having to stay there as the protector of the land now meant.
Yep.
Or they could have shown us a lot less and left us satiated that, there was an existential threat and it was all a bit scary and children were being killed.
Yeah, it could have been the horror of these things have happened and the scariest part is you have no idea why. The Lovecraftian kind of aspect. But so they showed, if they didn't show enough, then it would have been a lot more existential. But because they showed a little bit, I'm then going like you say, Janet's now the protector of the land or whatever against the evil. Why is the evil like picking a person to police them or keep other people away?
You scoffed when I said they'd done a Lost. But it's exactly what they did. They did a Lost.
But here's the problem. Lost did so many things that I don't know what specific thing you mean.
Hurley having to stay.
I didn't know that, to be fair. I didn't watch Lost, so I know a bit about it, but I don't.
So at the end of Lost, Hurley basically stays to like be the new Brandon and stop whatever evil is there getting out, and he becomes like the immortal protector of the land.
Right. So with this, again, I'm asking like, why is this evil town? Because it seems to be like one entity that's possessed all the people in the town or something, or replaced them.
Yeah, when they say you get a slight insight into it in that one panel when they're in town and they say, we don't do that here.
Yeah.
We like to get Janet's smoking. And like 3 or 4 of them.
He's doing the smoking thing with his hands.
Yeah. In a deeply audio medium.
I'm getting across, just in case.
And you get that kind of that sense of like a hive mind at play, don't you?
Mm. And again, because it raises certain things like the witch Agnes next door. She is immediately gets to a point where it's like, oh no, she's good and she's actually trying to help you. And it's like, okay, red herring, like I appreciate that. And then she's like, you have to say that she keeps saying the day of the week.
Yeah. So they don't listen.
Yeah, but and that's she's crazy. Oh, wait a minute, no, she's not. That's the rules. But again, if you're giving me any kind of rules, then I'm like, all right, why? How does that work?
And then we get to the end and they just say, it's Sunday. And you're like, cool, nice one, guys.
But then also at one point she's like, you have to, she leaves saucers of milk out. And they're like, oh, she's crazy because she ain't got no animals, but she's leaving a saucer out. And then she's like, later, she's like, you have to leave saucer out. They need something to take or they take you. It's like, why? What are these rules? Like, is this an evil Santa Claus? Like, what are we dealing with here? And this is me as the horror fan. Like, this is what I was saying with Maniac. I'm like, I want to know what the deal with the Maniac is. And I feel like that's going to give me answers.
Well, it starts to at the end, doesn't it?
Exactly. But it only gives it right at the end of the Maniac.
Yeah. In comparison, the Maniac of New York, I had some quite cold opinions about it, didn't I? During the recording. But in comparison, if we're comparing and contrasting, that is an example of horror done well, and this is an example of horror falling completely flat.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, like, I was just asking so many questions, and I did the reread because one thing I was scared of was because of how loose the kind of story gets at points and the exposition, it did way more exposition for where the characters are and what their situation is. But as soon as it gets to the horror, it's like, I'm going to give you a little bit just to get annoyed, just to blue ball you a bit, but then not enough to actually answer any questions. And then again, so towards the end, Agnes has to sacrifice herself because Janet was going to give herself, and then it's like, oh no, Agnes is taking your place. Like, cool, but why? And it's like, oh no, you have to be the protector of the land now. And it's like an evil being like, it's like the vampires in Buffy the Vampire Slayer being like, we've elected a new vampire slayer. Like, what? Like, surely you don't want one. Like,
it's like one of the zombies in The Walking Dead holding elections.
Yeah,
just to be like who's going to hit us with a bat?
You're the survivor now. We'll still go after you.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. And like, again, because, you know, I have a bit of a penchant for like folklore and old stories, I was, after I read this, I spent like 20 minutes thinking about it. I mean, that's how long I ruminated on this comic before coming into the podcast. I really didn't give this much of my time. Trying to ruminate on it and think of like a folkloric precedent. I was like, is there like a folkloric story, an old folk story where this kind of thing happens and these are the rules of it? And I couldn't think. Often with this kind of stuff, you can be like, oh, this trait that dates back to this tradition from this culture, and this is kind of where they're ripping from. Here it was like they're just doing a thing. And I couldn't even think of a precedent for it, so I couldn't even think of like a storytelling framework that I could slot this into and kind of, you know, add some headcanon to make it make sense for myself. It just doesn't make any sense.
There was one bit that I was like, okay, this kind of works for me. And it's a very isolated bit. It's Janet, we think is so there's this whole thing with the being in the underground.
Yeah.
Which is not explained, but at least with that, I can be a bit more like, it's just a weird thing that's happening.
Because Janet, Casey, and Isabel all get taken to the underground at some point, don't they?
And the underground, you are basically just hallucinating and lost in this other world kind of thing.
Yeah.
And with Janet, she gets pulled out by Agnes, who we later discover is some kind of protector for some reason, as we've established. But she pulls her out and she says, she kills a bird. And she says, I gave the bird your death. And that's how I brought you out. And for me, at least, I was like, all right, here's some very kind of basic magic of like, transponding the death that Janet would have experienced onto the bird. And that's magic that works. And I'm like, fair enough. Because I said on a previous episode, we were talking about like science fiction. And I said science fiction has a little more of like a, yeah, but how does it work? Because it's science, but a fictional version of it. Magic has this kind of get out of jail free card, which is like, it's magic.
Yeah.
Like, don't worry about it.
These are the
magic.
rules of this magic, and this is why it makes sense.
And on that basis, I was like, I accept that this is how this magic works. Like, you've told me plainly, and I'm like, fine. But with the whole larger story and the larger horror, it's like, but you've told me a little bit, but I have so many unanswered questions, and I don't feel the weight of like, what did this family escape? Because I don't know what the stakes really were.
Yeah.
Like at one point, Oliver is saying to the Casey clone, who is just a part of the whole evil, but he's kind of like, why are you doing this? Why don't you just kill me? Kind of thing. And that's never answered.
Yeah.
So again, that's posing the question for me of like, were they in danger? Like, what is being in the underground? Do they die if they're in the underground for too long? Casey was in there for quite a while, and she seemed fine at the end. Like, I don't know. And then again, the whole town is meant to be this possessed thing, but then at the beginning, the two huntsmen or fishermen or whoever they are find the body who we think is Casey, but it's actually Agnes.
Yeah.
And incidentally as well, great shading pitch black on the corpse. I thought that was a nice touch of an artistic choice. But like, it describes like these two men are good men, and that's why they're trying to. It's like, all right, do they live in the town, or are they exempt from the evil as well? Like, have they been given status of like, you're fine, you put out sources of milk, so we're going to leave you intact, kind of thing? Again, just raised way too many questions for me.
Yeah,
I think that's all we can really say about it. I made a lot of notes, and I've not even touched them because I think it was just getting into like the vibe and the story and everything.
Yeah, I mean. So there are episodes, right, where something isn't necessarily that good, but there's like this thematic structure that's happening that I find interesting. And there's something that I can latch onto and be like, oh, this is a really interesting way of getting into this conversation about this other thing. There's none of that happening here. Like, it didn't trigger off any interesting places in my brain. Like, nothing that interesting happens here, does it?
I was interested in what was happening until the end, which sounds weird, but again, because then everything's just resolved, but I don't know why or how or, you know.
Yeah.
So I only felt like that at the end because I was still waiting for this is the danger they were in, and I didn't really get that. And I don't think every horror needs to necessarily explain the danger, but you at least need to have like a confident feeling in
you need to, you need to, as the reader, you need to have a sense of the danger. Because if not, you're just watching a bunch of characters do things.
Yeah.
And that's fine when you're dealing with drama or thrillers, because watching a bunch of characters do things is what you're there for, right?
Yeah.
But when it's a horror, you need to feel that sense of dread. And even if it doesn't scare you, you need to have a sense of what is scary. And I just didn't really have that here.
As I said, there were isolated, like we've said, there were isolated moments which were good, but they were kind of fewer and further in between that they didn't really carry the story successfully.
I suppose they were in amongst enough bollocks that they didn't have enough breathing room to be effective.
Yep. And one little bit I did make a note on, it's kind of one of those I thought was good enough to make a point of. I appreciate the relative horror of Casey destroying the testosterone for Oliver.
Yeah.
Or Oliver's testosterone.
And eating Isabel's stuff.
Yeah. But with the testosterone specifically, what I did appreciate there is it did try and make a allegory for destroying something that makes you.
Yeah.
And in a kind of more of a elevated horror version of like a traditional death or violence, it's like, I've destroyed a thing that is making you who you are, who you feel you need to be.
And I suppose without it, you would very quickly start to regress into a version of yourself that you're not comfortable being.
Exactly. So it felt like a very personal attack that was kind of transcended the normal physical violence, if that makes sense.
And it's a great allegory for what's happening with trans people at the moment who often struggle to access healthcare.
Exactly.
And so, a lot of people are forced to live inside bodies that they're not entirely comfortable in or that don't feel represent who they are. Because of lack of access to the very thing that she broke. And he references, how hard it's going to be for him to get that medicine in this new place.
Yeah.
And so, there's some of that happening. But again, so far and few between, there's these tiny little moments that give us glimmers of interest here. But then it's set inside such a turgid story that I just kind of find it hard to get excited about any of it.
I feel like I would like to see the next thing from this writer. I think that again they're an award-winning writer, and I always feel bad criticizing anything by anyone. Like anyone who pours themselves into making anything, I feel bad for criticizing.
Who are we to criticize it, right?
Unless it's Brian Michael Bendis, and then he can fucking go hell. But
did you hear that, Brian?
He's successful. It's fine. Like
coming on the podcast, Brian. We've got some ideas for you.
The ones with shit, like just deal with it. He's fine. He made characters that we're big fans of, but I feel bad, as I said, like they're already a award-winning writer. I don't want to come across as just being like contrarian or anything.
Yeah.
Like and that's what I mean. I'd like to see if they can improve on these gaps, but I feel like if we're the only ones pointing them out, then what are the odds? Like they're probably going to keep doing what's made them successful.
I mean, again, unlike the ones, there's nothing here that's truly terrible. It's just
if that's some noble failures or noble misses.
Yeah. I mean, it was a big swing and a miss, wasn't it?
Yeah, it went for something that, with better execution, could have been a lot better.
Because it didn't. And I think this is probably why this episode's been quite calm, is that it wasn't that good. But also there was nothing bad enough in it to really rile me. It just all left me feeling a bit flat.
I mean, this is why, comparatively, I get a lot more passionate about bad superhero stories.
Because it's so bad.
And but having read good ones, and the good ones are very famous ones that everyone's read. It's like, why can't you see how what you're doing is not like the thing that we, hoped it could be?
Yeah.
Whereas this is such a new area in modern fiction, like combining these relatively new social issues. And I say relatively new, trans people have been around for forever, but they've entered the mainstream a lot more recently.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's so interesting because the idea of two spirit people is a feature of Native American culture that existed for thousands of years. But the trans people as they exist in the popular conscious of like 21st century Western culture, it's a relatively new issue. It's not a new concept. It's not something that wasn't happening before. But it entered the popular consciousness in a big way in the past decade, didn't it?
Yeah. And they're definitely being scapegoated by the American right
a lot more recently. All over the place, yeah.
Because they, as I said, they've been around forever. They've been in the public consciousness for a lot longer. But it's only recently the right seem to have suddenly taken an issue, and that's suspicious to me.
I mean, we've talked about this, haven't we? I think it was within our lifetimes that the language around trans people and transitions stopped being as pejorative as it always had been.
Yeah.
Like, the only words that we really had in the popular conscious for trans people were what are now considered slurs.
Yes.
Until, quite recently.
I think I'd be very interested to hear a trans comic book fan's take on this. Like, how does this stack up in terms of their lived-in experience? Is this a good representation of it? Because, again, I'm saying all this like, this was really good for me to see the side. I don't know how accurate it is.
Yes.
Like, it seems accurate with my limited experience and naivete.
Yeah, and I've dealt with a lot of trans people in my time and been friends with a bunch, and this seems quite close to the experience that they explained to me. But again, are they doing the same thing that this is doing and essentializing their experience when they're having conversations with me to pitch at a level that I'll understand? And
once we are far more successful at the podcast, we will endeavor to try and get as many different voices and opinions, so it's not just two cis white men talking about, this comic wasn't good. Like,
that's what they're here for, man.
I mean, that is the all we have to offer. Like, it's our one thing, really.
I mean, unless you want to hear from the cat, we are the only two people in this room.
Exactly. So, yeah, I think we've said as much as we can on this subject, and we are wrapped up a little earlier.
Well, no, because it's time for something big and important.
I'm surprised by this, so I mean, unless I'm not, but let's hear it.
You shouldn't be, because you sent it to me.
Yeah, but it's not modern news. It's like an old clip.
Yeah, I know, but we discovered.
I sent Jamie a old interview clip with Alan Moore.
And what did Alan Moore have to say in that interview clip, Ryan?
Alan Moore basically got across the widely disputed argument that Stan Lee did not create any of the big successful things that he takes credit for.
Which is wild, because it's like an icon of the podcast. The best comic book writer of all time. Taking jabs at somebody who inarguably moved comic books further forward than anybody else in a single lifetime could have done.
I mean, he was the pop culture representation of modern superhero comics, easily.
Yeah.
But his kind of argument was that he, having worked with these people, he got across the Stan Lee was taking the credit for a lot of Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby's work. Now, if you're a superhero fan through and through, you know these names already. If you're not, Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko were writers who worked along Stan Lee, and they're credited as being co-creators with Stan Lee for a lot of most famous superhero characters of Marvel. Especially, biggest example, Steve Ditko, big hand in creating Spider-Man. Yeah. But Alan Moore, who is doing this kind of public interview, it's like a talk. And did you notice his public speaking cadence very similar to Stuart Lee?
Yeah, absolutely.
But
they're from a similar part of the country, though.
Yes, and our friends, so that makes sense.
Are they mates?
Yeah, they interview. One of them interviewed the other, so they're friendly for sure.
Imagine sitting down for a pint.
I would never feel more stupid than being in a conversation with the two of them.
Because they're both vastly intelligent men, aren't they?
The one thing I could have, because obviously you don't want to be like, I'm a big fan of you two, because who wants hanging out with fans? The one thing I think I would have to like make any kind of like relatability with Stuart Lee especially, I'd be like, I really like Incredible Hulk because he's a big Hulk fan. So that's the one thing I'd have.
I mean, we'd be able to have a good conversation about like alternative post-punk from the 80s.
I mean, you would be, yes.
Yeah, I feel like Stuart Lee and I could chat about music for a bit. I think the thing is, like, I wouldn't have picked them as friends, but then when you think about them and their actual personalities, not their public personas, they're actually quite similar chaps.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
They're both like expert storytellers. Have you read any of Stuart Lee's novels?
No, I've only read his book on stand-up.
Oh, my life and deaths as a stand-up comedian is fabulous. For anybody who's not read it, it's an annotation of one of his stand-up sets. I believe if you prefer a milder comedian. It's a bunch of
his sets. Like, it's a lot of sets.
It's a couple of his sets post-comeback, because he went away and then came back again. Annotated beautifully by an Oxford-educated writer. Like, he's an incredibly well-educated, incredibly intelligent man, annotating his own work, but he's also real humble and just really understanding of the fact that he's just a bloke who tells jokes, even though he has elevated that to just pure jazz, you know? Like his work is it's so good.
It's pretentious stand-up comedy that works.
Yeah, right. Like it's still funny even though it's highly concept driven.
And he plays into his own pretension as well. Like he's very self-aware of that.
And his whole thing is alienating the audience, but in a really charming way that kind of you feel that discomfort with him, but you're in on the joke because you know it's him doing it and it's really funny.
And then he makes the challenge of winning them back as well.
He's so good.
But so in this talk with Alan Moore, he quotes that Stan Lee, whenever talking about Spider-Man and Steve Ditko, he would always use the exact phrase, I believe or I feel that Steve Ditko is the true creator, or like he was the main creator. And Alan Moore posits that he says that because maybe legally he's not allowed to say, Steve Ditko created Spider-Man.
Yes.
Like he has to say, well, in my opinion, or I feel, and it's kind of like that get out of jail kind of thing. He also makes a reference that Stan Lee, in one interview at least, said something along the lines of like, oh yeah, when me and Kirby made Captain America. And to any normal fan, you'd be like, yeah, all right, fair enough. That's a Marvel superhero, fair enough. The problem with that is that Captain America was created like during the war, so Stan Lee was like 12 at the time, or even pre-war, potentially even, or pre-World War II at the very least. So obviously Alan Moore's taken that. He's gone, maybe that's a slip of the tongue, but also is it, or was that just him? Is that just what he does? Yeah.
And again, I don't want to speak ill of an icon. Also an icon who can't rebuttal at this point, which is, really tragic because it was a great loss, I think, to the community and to everybody who loves comic books. That one of the great progenitors of this medium, shuffled off this mortal coil. But yeah, no, I just thought it was interesting because it was Alan Moore news that you sent to me. So I was like, we have to bring it up. And because we have time left and I'm just enjoying chatting with you, what are you excited about in comics at the moment?
I am currently reading the Fall of X.
You keep, Joe, people keep talking to me about this. And so we're going to have to do it at some point, aren't we? We're going to have to talk about it.
Well, here's the thing, though. So,
oh no,
so X-Men was kind of soft rebooted in a large conceptual way by Jonathan Hickman.
Yeah,
and if you know the name Jonathan Hickman, he's a guy he's big in his. He is a great writer for these big, grand setting out of like universes, worlds, and stuff. For me personally, he had a seminal run on the Fantastic Four, which really brought into focus not only the large space universe aspect of the Fantastic Four, but also really well wrote the characters and the family aspect as well. One of the great tropes that I think he introduced and is now a running thing is the Fantastic Four, the Mr. Fantastic and the Invisible Woman. They have 2 children. I can't remember their names. Franklin and
Roosevelt.
I thought you could say Rose for a second. I was like, oh, an honest guess. Nope, no, it wasn't that at all. But he has, they have these kids and a boy and a girl. The girl is ridiculously intelligent, like got that from
Reed.
Is
this the one who she ends up being friends with Lex Luthor because there's no one else that matches her
Wrong universe. Doctor Doom.
Doctor Doom, yeah.
But so that is a trope, is that they speak to Doctor Doom, and Doom actually, being one of the most evil characters in Marvel, in the universe, actually likes talking to Val Richards, and they have they develop a bit of a relationship of just like, not even quite mentor-mentee, but like Doom is such an intelligent character and he knows he's intelligent, but Val is possibly the most intelligent character. She's smarter than Reed Richards. So Doom likes this kind of like speaking to someone finally on his level kind of thing, though he would never admit that someone is on his level, but you can tell he tacitly enjoys it.
And that's a super interesting character trope. And when you told me about it, it put me right in mind of Negan and Carl.
Yeah.
And I know that wasn't a super intelligence thing, but it was an attitudinal thing.
Yeah.
Like Carl's a little bit of a nutcase.
Yeah. And what that does as well, Fantastic Four, really brings into focus the fact that Doom and Richards, I mean, the most canons, they were friends university, but then Doom basically gets super jealous of Richards because he knows that Richards is smarter than him, and then they become enemies. And you can tell that with Doom actually getting on with and liking Val Richards God, I hope that's her name, or I've just got that wrong. Someone's screaming at the podcast if I've got
comicletter@gmail.com. Yeah. You know where to tell us.
But what it says to me, and I think a lot of readers, is that it reinforces the idea that Doom and Reed Richards should be friends.
Yeah.
They are so similar, and it's Doom's own vanity and delusions of grandeur, which is interesting because he is one of the most intelligent people and is a king of his country and all that.
And it's an interesting trope that runs through comic books, particularly in the X-Men, because you've got Magneto and Charles Xavier, but then also to a lesser degree you've got Bruce Banner and whoever plays Sasquatch.
That's a lesser known one. Like, definitely that was unique to the Hulk specifically and not kind of as well known.
Yeah, but it's that same vibe, isn't it?
It's a good one with comics of like, here's someone who's similar to them and they can kind of bounce and reflect to the character off. And
they were friends and now they're not, kind of thing. And it's, it runs through comics. I mean, to a certain degree, Spider-Man and a lot of his villains, one of his villains was the Green Goblin, was like his best mate's dad or something.
Yes, Norman Osborn, yeah.
Yeah, Norman Osborn. Real superhero fans are like screaming at the screen now, like, why have you got this idiot talking about comic books?
I'm getting stuff wrong, and they're probably more angry at me than you.
But there's an expectation that I don't know.
The problem with the X-Men and Hickman's run is, if you were an X-Men fan before, what he did rejuvenating the characters and their world within the universe was such a breath of fresh air, but also like high quality like writing.
Yeah.
The problem is that it's kind of impenetrable if you don't know all the stuff beforehand.
Yeah.
So the way it starts with a character who's in the X-Men universe, but is a human called Moira Taggart or McTaggart.
Yeah.
And she's kind of a on-off love interest with Charles Xavier.
Right, okay.
It turns out in this X-Men run, when he reboots it with, I think it was called X something. Oh, God, I can't remember the names of the titles.
Ex Machina?
Something with an X in. But it basically transpires. It goes way into the future, like thousands of years into the future.
Yeah.
Because what it turns out is Moira actually is a mutant. But her mutant power is the power of reincarnation, which basically means when she dies, she is psychically sent back to her birth with all the previous life. So,
that's my kink.
So,
I'm like 100%, that's just what I want.
So they go thousands of years into the future because what's happening is humans make anti-mutant robots and AI, which then supplants them, and it becomes mutants versus AI.
We're already starting to see. You know how every generation of comic books has what they think to be the biggest existential threat to be?
Yeah.
So like in the 40s, it was like genetically altered stuff. And then
the Spider-Man reference, what the spider is radioactive, and it's genetically altered.
Yeah, so we had GM, and GM was a big buzzword for a long time, genetically modified, and then radioactive, and now we're getting AI being that big existential buzzword. I love that.
Yeah.
Like, because it's so cyclical, isn't it?
So then what happens is, because Moira's lived this thousands of years into the future life, she then dies, and you see the death like thousands of years later. She goes back, and then she basically goes to Xavier. She's like, hey, read my mind.
Yeah.
Xavier reads her mind and goes, oh shit, like, what's all this? And then she's like, right.
Such a nice use of his powers.
Yeah. And she's like, with my knowledge, right, we are going to, you, me, and Magneto, you two need to just come together and like sort it out so we can build this thing. And what's great is it starts with this Krakoan society where there's a kind of living island from another dimension.
Yeah.
This is where we start getting into being very impenetrable, because this is new stuff at this point. But I'm like, I'm up for it. Like, let's go. They basically establish themselves as an independent country of mutant society. And what this becomes is the philosophies of Xavier and Magneto meeting in the middle. Yeah. So whereas they were enemies because they had such different beliefs, like opposite beliefs, they come together in this. Like, so Xavier's always like, we need to work with mankind and, integrate with them. He's the Martin Luther King to Magneto's Malcolm X, essentially.
That's a big fucking statement for a white man.
Well, I mean, the whole X-Men trope was built off the idea of racism. But it was built off the racism of superpowered people as opposed to black people.
By the way, just to intersect, if you had an X-Men comic, right, and you had a really misogynistic X-Man who saved the day, the issue could be called Deus Ex Meninist.
That is a good one.
I've been sitting on that for like 20 minutes.
There was also a trans comedian who I saw in London who had a great joke about the fact that she was a Marvel superhero because she was an X-Man. And that's just great wordplay. Like,
that's really great.
Yeah. But
no, it sounds like a really interesting run, but this is the problem with it. And I think this is the problem with it in context here, is that it would need to be a multi-episode run that we did on it, wouldn't it? Because it's so dense. Like, even just hearing you talk about it now, I've cut you off.
Yeah.
Like a quarter of the way through what you needed to say, because like this isn't an X-Men episode, but also it's interesting, but there's a lot of it.
So there is a series, a limited series that kind of started the reboot. So they did the limited series, and then it was like X-Men #1. We're now doing the ongoing ones. We could potentially do that limited series. So that's like the reboot series, essentially. That's kind of limited in itself, like it's its own series. I think that would be fascinating to get your take on not knowing any of the stuff, or at least beyond what I've told you about. But yeah, I'm reading now Fall of X. This is the part where Jonathan Hickman's actually no longer in it.
Right, okay.
But it's been taken over by a few different writers who are doing different aspects.
Season 5 of Community, baby.
Kind of, yeah. But it's going well. It's generally it's got
Season
it's
5
in good
of
hands.
Community was pretty good. Or is it 4? Which season is it that he wasn't
the Gas Leak series. It's 4 or 5, I think.
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about, though, right?
Yeah, exactly. And but this has gone, I think, a little better than that. To be fair, one of the writers who's taken over part of is Al Ewing from the Immortal Hulk series. So
which I liked, didn't I?
Yeah, you enjoyed it.
I can't remember. I remember talking about it. I don't remember if I liked it or not.
Yeah, and the other one is a comic writer called Kieran Gillen, who I've read a few things from.
Why do I recognise that name?
So I'm genuinely looking up right now to see if he's done a series that we have done or not.
Yeah.
Which I'm just now looking through.
I mean, it's hard to remember because we're like, nearly 40 episodes in now or something?
Yep, almost 40 episodes of this podcast.
It's wild, man.
But Kieran Gillen, he's done some good stuff. One of his that I really liked was a series called Die, and it was kind of Dungeons and Dragons meets Jumanji, where they were sucked in, and that was very well written.
Haven't we talked about that yet?
I don't know, but that's a great one, and that has a great trans allegory in that as well. Because one of the characters is a man who plays as a female character, and that comes into whole like him feeling more comfortable as the female character in the world and stuff.
That's a really astutely noticed feature of D&D, which is that actually a lot of young trans people do that. Like, you know, it's a fantasy world that you create for yourself, and so you go into it to experience other things, and if that's something you want to experience, it's a really convenient way of doing that. So that's actually a really like astute observation by that writer.
I've found the one that Kieran Gillen wrote that we read. I'm just gonna Google it to confirm. So 2 seconds. So he wrote the 2015 Darth Vader comic.
Oh, the one that we both really enjoyed.
Exactly, yes.
I
knew there was one there, yeah.
That's where I know the name from.
So,
that was sick.
So he's now the kind of main X-Men writer now, along with Al Ewing doing a lot of the other titles around it as well. And with some other writers who I don't think I've read anything of or haven't noticed yet. But those were the two names that I was like, oh, these guys, they know what they're doing. Like, it's in good hands. So, yeah, we'll do something X-Men related at some point. There'll be some X-Men stuff come out, like, at some point.
Because we've not, have we?
Not yet. And I think the reason is, like, a lot of stuff we've done is tie-ins for things.
Yeah.
The X-Men, they're the Fox-owned movies.
Yeah. It's a whole thing, isn't it?
Well, they're now owned by Disney, so they are going to do... Yeah, so they're going to do some X-Men stuff.
Are they bringing it into the MCU, then?
So it's kind of assumed they will, because inevitably... But
there's not a lot of synergy there, though, is there?
Well, so what we don't know right now is whether they're going to reboot the MCU first.
Oh, fuck, are they already there?
They might. I think they're considering it. The talks have been had, like, undoubtedly.
God, does that mean we have to go through a whole new set of, like, retellings of origin stories?
Maybe. I mean, if they're smart, they won't.
Post Robert Downey Jr. Iron Man would be weird.
a different actor playing them.
Well, this is it. This is what I mean. Yeah, like, because Iron Man's kind of gone now. Like, the Iron Man's not... I mean, again, I'm not that up on the MCU, but he did a die, didn't he?
He did, in fact, do a die, yes.
He did a pretty big die as well.
It was a notable die,
I feel like you and I were in the cinema together watching that one.
No, not that one.
I saw an Avengers film with you.
I don't think so.
Yeah, we did.
Do you remember which one?
It was you, me, and our friend, you're going to have to bleep his name out.
Maybe was it like Winter Soldier? Like
No,
way
it
back
was
in
an
the day?
Avengers one. Because I remember nudging you a lot and being like, who's that? And you got really frustrated with me.
The old Simpsons, who's that guy?
Yeah.
What that guy say when I asked who's that guy?
Yeah, like...
I'll tell you one thing.
Do you not remember this?
I don't think we did. And we're going to have to like get into this off the air to like proper get like names and dates and stuff.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure we didn't. But
it might have been Infinity War.
no, I definitely saw that before I moved back.
It was one of the Avengers films that came out while you were
This is probably not entertaining listing.
No, it's not. No, it's not.
When did we do that thing? Was it
you
before
could just
the
edit
other
this chunk
thing?
out.
Well, we've done a funny now, so it's kind of saved it for this part. But one thing I'll finish on is that when I went to see Winter Soldier, I saw it with the aforementioned friend who I bleeped out earlier. But this was kind of a big moment for me of like, I always need to go to the toilet like midway through a film.
Yeah.
Like I can't do especially if I'm drinking a drink, which I love a big cold soft drink with a film.
Yeah.
Like I can't make a full hour, like let alone an hour and a half, 2 hours, wherever they are.
Can you remember when we went to see the second Spider-Man animated film?
That I made it through.
And we just got those monstrously big Diet Cokes. They were like 3 pints or something.
And that film was so good that I didn't even notice.
Yeah, because we both bolted out at the end and we were like, just fuck.
Come back for the post-credit scene. Like
that was a great film.
That was. But so watching Winter Soldier, and one of the big things in that is that Nick Fury dies early on, right? And then there was a big fight scene, big highway fight scene, really great, like generally great film. And the fight scene ends, like big chase scene, all that kind of ends. So I go, right, it's all stopped now. It's going to be a bit of slow stuff until the next big scene. So I'm going to run quickly and come back. And I go and come back. And when I come back, Nick Fury's alive again. And I don't know how. So I turn to my friend and go, how is Nick Fury back? And he literally goes, I have no idea. I wasn't really paying attention. I'm like, jeez Christ. Like,
I left you here as tribute.
What are you good for if not this? And that was my kind of like Joker origin story where I was like, I will never leave mid-film again if I can help it. That's the story. Maybe that'll be a short. Maybe I can put some Captain America Winter Soldier stuff in the background for that.
Yeah, we can do that.
Yeah, that'll be one.
Well, it's been lovely to just have a chat with you on air.
Yeah, I mean, we get quite dense like comics that we talk a lot about,
yeah.
And this one it didn't meet the usual expectations.
So it wasn't so much,
and
that's okay.
That'll happen sometimes.
So thank you so much for listening. As has been referenced multiple times during this podcast, if you want to send us an email, comicliterate@gmail.com. We love to hear from you.
And if it's particularly egregious, we'll read it out.
Absolutely. If you want to review it. Just even if it's offensive. 5 stars, baby. That's all we want.
I mean, we'll bleep out like specific like words that we don't want on the podcast, but we'll get your sentiment across. Like,
yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for listening. Watch the shorts. Good night.
Thank you. Goodbye. Ooh, spooky season. I almost forgot that.
Spooky season, motherfuckers.